Hello there. Now I'd like to talk about the third and final part of the speaking test. So, as you might know, the third part of the speaking test is the most difficult part of the speaking test, and that's because, on one hand, it's different structurally than the other two parts of the test, but also because of the types of questions you're asked, the language demands on you are going to be much greater, and that's really why this part of the test is more difficult than the other two. IELTS also makes a distinction between familiar language situations and unfamiliar language situations. So a familiar language situation is talking about your own experiences. Do you like traveling? What kind of foods do you like? Do you like going out with your friends? Simple, familiar topics. Whereas unfamiliar topics are questions that, frankly, even if you ask a native English speaker questions from part three of the speaking test, they can often have a hard time answering because they're unfamiliar situations. So asking people, do you think it was easier for people to communicate in the past than it is now? Or do you think technology will change education a lot in the future? Now, they're not looking for right or wrong answers. They're simply looking for how you express yourself, how you're using language to answer the questions. But these are not the kinds of questions that people think about in their day-to-day lives, and that's why they're unfamiliar. So if you imagine most of these questions, trying to answer them in your own language or native language would also be difficult sometimes, simply because they're not the types of things that people normally think about. The other thing that's different about this part of the test is that it's a conversation, or it's like a conversation. It's not a very natural feeling conversation because it's in an exam situation. You're speaking to a stranger and you're answering questions that are on these unfamiliar topics, which are difficult to answer. But it is a conversation in the sense that in part one of the speaking test, the examiner asks you set questions which are written down in a book, and then you answer them. And there's a protocol for what happens. Like, they can ask you once, then they can say the question again. If you don't understand, then they move on. In part two, it's very controlled. You're given an exactly 1 minute to prepare for the test, and then you speak for a very prescribed amount of time. And if you don't, there are certain things that happen one way or the other. And anyway, it's all very controlled, and it's all you responding to specific language situations, questions, or speaking about a topic. Now, many of the questions that the examiner will ask you in part three of the speaking test are also from the book of questions. But what's different is the examiners are required to ask you follow-up questions about what you say in order to challenge you, in order for you to extend your answers and to develop your ideas and see how that affects your use of language. And that's another reason why it's much more difficult than part one and part two. So let's say part two was about a friend that you had. Now, the questions in part three are going to be probably about friendship on one or two subtopics about friendship. What that means is they're not going to ask you about what you said in part two, but you're going to have a more abstract, general discussion about friendship. And so, for example, if the examiner asks you, what do you think are important qualities to have in a good friend? And you think for a moment and you say, well, I think it's important for a good friend to have some common interests and to be interested in you as a person and to be honest. Now, the examiner might listen to what you say and respond, why do you think it's important for a good friend to be honest? Now, the reason they're asking you that is because that's something that you said. And this is the kind of thing where you've got to be prepared to continue speaking about things that you've said in your answer. And this can be one of the reasons why this part of the test is difficult. And so generally, you should approach this type of question as any other question. Just briefly think about it for a second, give your answer, base the length of your answer on what you have to say and nothing else, and then stop talking when you're done and wait for the next question. So if you look in the lesson notes that are under the video on the website, you'll see different examples of the types of questions that you'll get. When you're using practice materials for part three, it's really important that you use authentic materials. So part two questions are quite easy to come up with. You find them on the internet, and even ones that aren't actual IELTS questions, a lot of them are reasonably similar. So if you practice with them, it's not really an issue. Same with part one. They're simple questions. most students with some practice can write authentic sounding part 1 questions for the speaking test. But because of this conversational nature of the last part of the speaking test, if you look on some of the websites where people report questions from the test, you see part 1 questions and part 2 questions, and you'll see the grammar's not quite right, maybe the phrasing's not quite right, but basically the questions sound like part 1 questions and sound like part 2 questions. Now, when people report part 3 questions, they're both reporting the types of questions which are listed in the book that they were asked, and also they're reporting the follow-up questions, which don't make any sense out of context usually. So they might be about very specific things someone said, and if you take that question out of context of the rest of their answer, they really don't make sense, and they're not the kind of question that you should prepare for when you're preparing for the test. So the Cambridge books are probably the best source of these types of questions. And if you look in the back of each test in the Cambridge book, so there's generally 4 tests, you'll find a page on speaking tests, and they have like just a selection of part 1, they have a part 2 question, and then a selection of part 3 questions. Now those are realistic questions that might appear in the test. Also, if you look in the useful links section of the website, you'll find links to IELTS.org and some British Council sites, which also have some authentic questions that you should use to practice. And so this is important because, practicing with real questions like you're going to get in the exam is important. And you don't want to practice with these odd questions that people have reported that there's no way that anyone will ask you during your exam. This can make practicing for part 3 a little bit difficult and make it really important for you to have a mock speaking test with someone who knows how to do this, who knows how to ask these types of questions. So it's even difficult for IELTS examiners. So when IELTS examiners are monitored and checked for how they do, that's one of the things that they look for. And when I was an examiner for the first year or so, I often had trouble with this. It's just, you've got so many different things to focus on: the time, asking the question, thinking about very specific scoring criteria, maintaining the interaction between the candidate and the examiner. And so one of the things that I often had trouble with was asking these follow-up questions. So the examiner could just read through the questions in the book, and sometimes that happens, I guess. But what you want is someone who is going to pick out those places where it's possible to ask you to follow up and extend your answer and talk a bit more about something that you've said. So this can be one of the more difficult parts of the test, and you really need some practice having someone test your ability to do that. Another difference that you'll find in the third part of the test, so the first 2 parts of the test they're all about you and your personal experiences and your own ideas, and your preferences and likes and dislikes and things like that. So it's very easy for you to answer in the first person: I think, I like, I did this. Whereas part 3 is a more abstract, general discussion more about people in general. So if you have a part 1 question about travel, it might be, do you enjoy traveling? So that's a personal question to you. A part 2 question might be, tell me about a holiday that you enjoyed. Part 3 question could be something like, why do people travel? Or what do people learn from traveling? Or is traveling good for local people? Something like that. So it's getting you to think about human behavior in a more general sense, what people think, what people do, what people experience. So you don't always want to say, why do people travel? Well, I like to travel because I like to go places and experience new things. So the examiner will stop you if you repeatedly give answers like this, and they'll say, okay, fine, but what about other people? Why do people in general like to travel? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use your own experience as a way to answer. It just means that, you have to translate your answers into that kind of language. So if I'm thinking, well, geez, I don't know, why do people travel? Why do I travel? Well, I travel because I like to go places and experience new things. So you can just say, well, people travel because they like to go places and they like to experience new things. That might sound a bit silly, but because you're being asked these types of very broad, general questions, those are the types of answers that are expected. So you really shouldn't talk about yourself very much. There are also plenty of things which are similar between the earlier parts of the exam and the last part of the exam. So how you prepare and how you answer the questions is largely similar. So preparing, what you need to do is have a lot of practice with a wide variety of questions so that you're not surprised when exam day comes. Also, the more of these types of questions that you answer, the more you'll realize that there are broad similarities between the part 3 questions on various topics. So this question of, is there a difference between the way men and women, blah, 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 is Was this different in the past? Do you think this will change in the future? These types of questions are pretty common, and so you'll see them a lot. And once you get used to answering, talking about the differences between men and women, or older people and younger people, or talking about what you think might happen in the future, or how you think it might have been different in the past, explaining the differences between situations, the types of things that are listed in the lesson notes. Once you get used to answering those types of questions, that skill will transfer from one topic to another. So that's something that's similar, in that you just practice a lot to give yourself the best chance to be prepared for the exam. Another similarity is that you really want to just follow this 4-part strategy. Listen to the question, think about what you want to say it, and stop talking. Give your answer in a natural way, according to your own thoughts, and try not to think much about grammar or vocabulary. Be careful. Don't just make mistakes for the sake of making mistakes, but don't worry too much about making mistakes, and really focus on communicating your ideas clearly, like you do in the rest of the test, and that will have a positive effect on your performance in this part of the test. Being honest is a good strategy. Like, even if, like, let's say I ask you a question like, why do you think some people spend so much time playing sports? And if you think, I don't know, I don't know anything about sports, I don't like sports, I don't know any people who say sports. So if you say something like, I don't really know. I mean, personally, I'm not interested in sports, and I don't really understand why people spend so much time playing sports. Again, you're not talking about yourself, you're just talking about what you think about this topic. Now, one of the jobs of the examiner in part 3 is to maintain the interaction between the examiner and the candidate in a way that gives the candidate the best chance to display their language skills. So if you've said something like, I don't really know, like, I don't play sports, and I don't know anyone who plays sports, and I don't really understand why people like playing sports, you've told the examiner that this is an area which you have a difficult time talking about. They've been able to rate your language, explaining why it's difficult, so that the language that you've used, you get credit for. That's good. And that's a signal to the examiner to shift the topic onto something that you can talk about. So if you said something like that, the examiner might think, okay, so why do you think it is that some people don't find sports interesting? Now, that's on the same topic. It's a general question. It's asking you to respond in the same way, but it's shifted the focus of the question back towards something that you should be able to talk about, because you've said that you don't understand why people are interested in sports because you yourself are not interested. So really just, focusing on listening to the question, answering the question, and when you've said what you have to say, stopping. It's the best strategy that you can have. And over the course of the test, it will produce a good sample of language on a variety of topics in a variety of linguistic situations, which will mean that you don't need to worry about grammar, vocabulary, things like that. Just focus on answering the question, communicating clearly, and you'll do the best job that you can possibly do. As far as asking questions goes, that's slightly different in the 3rd part of the exam also. So it's a conversation, so you've got a little bit more flexibility when you don't understand something. So you could say, like, I don't understand the question. In that case, the examiner might rephrase the question. They might say it in a different way. Another part of their job is phrasing the questions in the 3rd part of the exam at a level that the candidate can understand. So you can imagine if you've got a band 3 candidate and a band 8 candidate, after part 2, the examiner has a pretty good idea approximately what your score is. They can't ask the same question in the same way to someone who's band 3 and someone who's band 8. So part of the examiner's job is to calibrate the question. So if you don't understand the way they've said it, it's quite normal for them just to think about it and say it in a slightly different way, or maybe they'll repeat it. You can clarify what they mean. So if you say, why do you think people travel? And then you say, do you mean, what is it that people learn from traveling? Or what do you mean, what's the reason for people traveling? Something like that. You can ask the examiner to clarify what they've said by rephrasing the question or questioning them about what they've said. Again, you can also ask for, if you don't understand the word in a question, you can ask them, what does that mean? What does this word mean? Something like that. So again, you've got more flexibility when it comes to questioning and clarifying what you're being asked to speak about before you speak. So if you need band 8 or higher, the development of your answers is particularly important. And part 3 of the speaking test is generally where your answers have the most opportunity for development. And I've said before that the types of questions that you're asked are in some ways similar to the types of question you're asked in writing test 2. And in that way, if you think about the kind of information you present and how you present it in a body paragraph in a writing task 2 essay, it's very similar to the way you would do it in part 3 of the speaking test. Now, you're not going to speak in a full paragraph, but saying what you think, clarifying it and explaining it, possibly giving an example, talking about the other point of view, things like this, that's what you're going to be doing in part 3. But the problem with always having this formula, okay, I'm going to answer the question, then I'm going to explain my answer, and then I'm going to give an example of what I'm talking about, and then I'm going to say what the result of that is, and then I'm going to give the opposing point of view. So if you've got this very strict structure in your head, what that means is sometimes when you're able to answer all of those questions, your answers will be very good. Other times you'll really struggle and you'll pause and you'll stop and you won't be able to continue because the structure that you are thinking about doesn't really match your experience plus the question that's asked. So those things will go together in a way that if you just follow the questions and your own thoughts, you'll be able to answer any question. But if you've got this very rigid structure in the back of your mind that you're trying to satisfy for every single question, you'll have a lot of trouble. And normally when I tell students this, they say, yeah, but part 3 is really important. I need to give long answers and I need to have some way to prompt myself to give long answers that are well developed. So first of all, if you need 7 or below, development isn't as important. But if you do need band 8, the same principle applies. So listen to the question, think about what you want to say it, and stop talking. The examiner doesn't know anything about you, only what they hear in those 11 to 14 minutes. And if your level of English is significantly below the score you need, there's literally nothing you can do to fool the examiner into thinking that your English is better than it is, because all of the questions are being asked over a long period of time. There are so many opportunities where you're going to make mistakes, and it's going to become clear to the examiner that you're not this level of English, you're this level of English. So you can't make the examiner think your English is better than it is. On the other hand, if you approach the test in the wrong way, you can definitely make the examiner think that your English is worse than it is. So like I said, they don't know anything but what they hear. So if what you're presenting to them is a lot of stopping, pausing, thinking, self-correcting, not giving a clear answer, then that's going to affect your score, and it's going to affect it negatively. So the way that you make sure that you can balance the need to give longer answers sometimes, and the need to give developed answers sometimes, and the need to give fluent answers in correct English is by the simple principle that there's going to be a variety of questions, and some of them it will be easier for you to give longer, more developed answers, and you should do that then, and others it won't, and you shouldn't do it then. So if you look at the image at the bottom of the lesson notes on the website, you'll see a picture of someone playing the piano with some sheet music in front of them. And the way I think about this, and I think it's helpful for most students who I've talked with this about, is if someone is playing music and they can read music and they're looking at the notes on the page, they're not playing at that time the note that they're looking at. They're looking further ahead, right? So they're playing whatever, these notes over here, but their eyes are over here. So they've looked through, they've kind of memorized what's coming, and they're looking for what's coming next so they can get prepared for what's coming after what they're playing now, for particularly difficult parts so that they can get ready for that and remind themselves of what's coming. And that's really how you should approach the speaking test. So as you're speaking, and again, this is something that if you remain calm and relaxed and don't speak too fast, it's much easier to do this, and that is think ahead. So think, where is this sentence going? When I finish this thought, what can I say? And if the answer is, I don't know, I've got nothing else to say, stop. Because what you'll do if you continue and you force yourself to keep speaking is you'll pause, you'll repeat yourself, you'll start making mistakes, your answer will lose coherence. It's not a situation you want to be in. If you start thinking, well, I could talk about this or that, but I don't really know the words for this thing. So again, don't put yourself in that situation where you have to talk about something that you can't. On the other hand, there will be opportunities when you think ahead and you think, what am I going to talk about next? And you think, okay, I could talk about that, yeah. I could talk about this, sure. I could talk about this, yep. I don't know the word for that, but I can describe what I'm talking about. If you do that, then what will result from just naturally answering the questions, honestly, with your own thoughts, is that you will have a variety of answers. Some of them will be longer, some of them will be shorter, some of them will be in the middle, some of them will be quite long, and that's what's expected. And by doing that, you'll present a good selection of the language that the examiner can evaluate, and you'll present those answers with a variety of grammar and vocabulary, which will naturally come out of just answering different questions on different topics. So really, when you think about part 3, it's very similar to how you approach answering questions. Just listen and answer and know when it's time to stop. But you do have to keep some things in mind about the different nature of the questions you'll be asked, the types of answers examiners are looking for, and giving yourself plenty of practice so that you know how to answer the different types of questions that you'll encounter on part 3 of the speaking test.